Dragons! It is I, Tantus Narvan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion of the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, 5th Ed D&D. Well, when we last left off, we finished talking about NPCs. Let's move on to talking about environments. Now, of course, just like because it's in the name, dungeons are a big part of Dungeons & Dragons. It's one of the main things you're going to explore. Ancient strongholds, dark temples deep underground, natural caverns, monster lairs, all kinds of strange and exciting places that find themselves in, effectively, a dungeon. But these aren't the only places you can explore in the world. Massive, strange jungles, huge mountainside layers, incredible, interesting islands that there's chains of them you travel in between are all fantastical locations you might want to explore. That might not be a dungeon. You might be climbing on the outside of a mountain, trekking through a jungle, traversing islands, crossing a desert. All options. Now the thing is, you're going to have to look at each of these intrinsically different. The dungeon and the wilderness. The dungeon has walls, doors, things that make it much more linear. You're going to have an idea of where everyone's going to travel within a dungeon. An open area, a wilderness, they can move in any direction. So you can see between the two of these is the predictability you're going to have for how the players are going to react in the environment. I'm going to have to only travel to certain places in the dungeon. Wilderness, which way do I want to go? Now this isn't to say these aren't the only areas you can have adventures. Villages, towns, and cities can have adventures of their own. While they're not going to have the same amount of monsters and dangers of creatures, you could have villains or dangerous NPCs which exist within a village or a city just the same as anywhere else. It has its own type of adventures with own intrigue and perils. You see, evil takes many forms, and an urban setting is not necessarily safe. It could have some kind of strange intrinsic danger that is adventure. Now, when we start talking about it, we have to think of the dangers that are going to be within these places. When we talk about dungeons, where they're an ancient tomb, natural cavern, monster lair, ancient stronghold, all of them are going to have different types of treasure to them. Different types of coins, gems, magic items, depending on what's there. They all intrinsically are going to function differently from each other. So that's the first thing we're going to think about when we're thinking about our world we're building, our dungeon we're building. Let's talk about equality. Why would I talk about equality? Equality is basically a small word or phrase that best describes my dungeon. It makes it unique. It makes it interesting. It makes it different than every other dungeon. It's not just ancient tomb. It's frozen ancient tomb. See, I've already added something to it. Now, there's an entire list in the book of suggestions of little words and phrases you can add to your dungeons to make them unique and interesting. And, of course, you could roll randomly, or you could use it as an inspiration for a dungeon, that you could take a look at them and be like, I like that one. I can come up with something based around this idea. Once I've got my basic idea of the dungeon down, who made it? See, this is another important aspect. Your players may never learn who made it, who was the construction behind the construction of this dungeon. But it might be important because of the motifs and decorations of it. If, for example, dwarfs made it, there might be dwarven art. There might be more carved stone than, let's say, if Beholder made it, who might have more vertical shafts because they float. So you can see, intrinsically, the form of the dungeon is going to alter dependent on whatever creature or creatures made this dungeon. Now, of course, once again, the book provides a list of basic creatures you could choose from, and some options that are sub-options based upon that. And it's up to you to roll, or again, choose and be inspired. Or, this is an important one, if your world you're building, because we did talk a little bit about world building, has some other creature which may be appropriate to building a dungeon, go ahead and choose that. This list isn't all-encompassing. These are some of the common ones. You can put anything you want as a creator, if it fits your world. That's the important aspect. fits your world. Now, unless it started out as a natural cavern, every dungeon is built for a purpose. Why was it built? Why was these creators decided to build this place? There are so many different purposes behind it, and you're choosing the one that you feel is matching with what you're building is going to be important, because again, it's going to narrow how you have things in the scope and kind of push you in a direction of what you want to put there, what you want to build. Some examples might be a death trap. It's a place made to kill those that enter, effectively. It's usually they're not maybe protecting something, they might be protecting something, but the entire idea about it is passing through this dungeon is more than likely going to get you killed. It's got filled with monsters, traps, etc. that are left behind in this dungeon, or areas that could be infested in this dungeon. That's all about murder. It could be a lair. Lair is very simple. Monsters live there. It's made for things to live in them. Granted, the entire purpose of being a lair would just be to have maybe pets. Hard to say. It's up to you to determine why this lair is like this. Or maybe it was made for a lair for something else, and now that's died out and something else is inhabiting it. Interesting little tidbit there that you could do. Maze. Confusing passages made to make people that enter it be confused and get lost and never find their way. Basically, it's a master of deception in constructed form. An abandoned mine. This is a little more interesting because it seems close to the natural caverns with the same amount of construction, but it was a place that was once a mine. Now it's abandoned. Now maybe creatures or things have moved into it. There you go, you have a dungeon. Planar gate. This is all about some kind of planar portal at the center of a dungeon, and the dungeon itself was built to protect it, maybe guard it, maybe house it. The exact nature of why this planar gate was in the middle of this dungeon, it'll be up to you to determine, but then you build things around it appropriately. Stronghold. The purpose of it was to be some kind of fortification for some kind of army. The army is more than likely gone now, died off, and has been replaced by whatever lives there. Or you could have some kind of battle against an army and some kind of fortification, but that's entirely up to you. That's a different kind of adventure entirely. But for just the classic dungeon delve, it's been long since abandoned by whatever forces once held it as their stronghold. And now this is what's left of it. Strongholds often could also be layers of villains and basically monster armies. Temple. This one's pretty interesting. It's some kind of temple dedicated to some kind of dark god or planar being that most likely there's some kind of cult worshipping them that's taken it over, some kind of temple area. It might still be worshipped there now. The temple, of course, cult might be dead and just what's left over might be there. Hard to say. Tomb. It's just that, it's a tomb. It's where dead people lie. Treasure hunters oftentimes like going into tombs. It's a temptation for treasure hunting type adventurers. And the dangers of a tomb arrive there. Traps. The dead might not be dead. And finally, Treasure Vault. Treasure Vault is exactly that. It's a place where gold, gems, magic items are being held deep within it. And everything based around it is made to protect this vault of treasure that someone was keeping here out of the way. They were hiding it away. They were keeping it safe and built everything around it to keep it safe. So you can see there is a wide variety of purposes behind your dungeon. That's it for today, though. We started talking about environments and, of course, started with the dungeon. We talked about environments as a basic whole, that there's dungeons, wildernesses, and urban environments. When we talk about dungeons, we have to talk about the motif of the dungeon, some kind of word or phrase that sums it up. We talk about the creators of it. We talk about its purpose, which its purpose is very complex and has a wide variety of them that it could have. Usually it might be based on the creators. It could be based on what you feel is appropriate to the story you're telling with your dungeon. In the next episode, we're going to talk about dungeon history, because that's an important thing to note too, and dive more into environments after that. We're going to keep going through them, because there's always fun to build interesting and fantastic environments where your PCs and NPCs can be in. But if you have any questions, comments, anything you would say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It's just support for the channel, the empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you can always check out my Patreon, link in the description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.